Welcome everybody to this second session of this great series of panels that have been put together by CIRC at X University in Toronto. I just want to start by saying a huge thank you to the organizers for the invitation to get to chair this panel. I'm really excited. We have a really interesting set of 3 papers that are going to take us across, I think, about 5 continents. And we're going to be kind of following on from the last session, but thinking about this time in terms of emerging and established global cities, but thinking about local policy, the role of state actors, and managing diversity from above. And I think state actors and also extra state actors as well, but thinking about that idea of diversity in the city from above. And we have 3 really dynamic speakers, Peggy Levitt, who's joining us from Wellesley College. We've got Jérémie Molho, who's joining us from the European University Institute, and Peter Scholten, who's joining us from Erasmus University. And then just quickly, I'm Sheryl-Ann Simpson. I will be your chair for this event. I am an assistant professor at Carleton University, but I grew up in Toronto in the West Indian community, the Caribbean community there in Toronto, and that's who my family is. And my work is on immigration in Canada, really in the prairies, and also in the Nordic region. And one of the things that I try and think about in my work is really thinking about immigration in cities, but also thinking about immigration as a technology, and particularly in the Canadian case, thinking about the ways in which immigration is sometimes used as a technology of settler colonialism. And what I mean by that is the ways in which immigration does this funny thing of kind of letting Canada forget over and over and over again who actually hosts the nation, and letting Canada forget over and over and over again kind of what had to happen for Canada to exist. So one of the things I'm really trying to do in my work now that I've moved to Carleton University in Ottawa is to really help in my own research, but then even more so in my teaching, help my students understand where our university is. To help my students understand the laws of the territories where our university is sited, and to really help my students think about how our work potentially changing Canadian institutions can support the sovereignty of the Algonquin nation that hosts Ottawa. So that's kind of part of where I'm coming from in this work. And I think that it actually in some ways fits really well into this broader panel where we're really thinking about some of those institutional questions and thinking about the ways in which law and governance and territory really shape the experience of immigrant residents, and also really help us to think about how immigrant residents can respond to those laws and territories. So with that, I will turn the stage, this funny virtual stage, over to our first speaker. And Peggy, that's you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Sheryl-Ann and Anna and Sintu and the whole CIRC team for making this amazing event and conversation happen. While new art world centers like Beijing, Sao Paulo, and Sharjah are on the rise and challenge the global cultural world's status quo, an equitable distribution of fame and fortune is still far out of reach. Using measures like financial and critical rankings, sociologist Alain Kamen concludes that most famous artists still come from the West. Germany, the UK, and the US account for the largest share. European and US artists like Jeff Koons, Gerhard Richter, or Jean-Michel Basquiat feature prominently, as do a few predictable non-Western superstars like Ai Weiwei or Elantan Sui. Still, growing numbers of artists and writers from Asia, Africa, and Latin America are able to break through, and some even manage to create new paths and nodes of cultural power. What makes this possible? In my work with colleagues Kang Sang Lee and Chantal Valdivia, we focus on the role of migration, labeling, and in particular, the flexibility of categories used, vernacularization, and policymaking in cultural decentering. The overarching question which connects this work to the themes of this conference is to what extent the decentering of the global cultural world writ large contributes to the decentering of national or urban cultural fields, and vice versa. What is the relationship, if any, between a more inclusive global cultural scene and creating more diverse cultural institutions within nations and cities? And what does the migration of art makers and art managers and the circulation of their ideas and works have to do with it? In my talk today, I can't yet answer that large question, although I hope we can discuss it together. What I can do is present the qualitative findings from our research on how cultural globalization actually unfolds in Argentina, South Korea, and Lebanon, although I'm only going to be talking about the first two cases today. We draw upon interviews with 275 artists and institutional actors and analyze nearly 8,500 records of exhibitions of works by 98 artists mounted around the world. Our qualitative and quantitative analyses of the career trajectories of the artists reveal the important role that migration for study, work, or settling abroad plays in the initial stages of gaining international attention and in creating new urban centers of power within the global art world. We also highlight the role that vernacularizers, and in particular, co-ethnic diasporic actors play in diversifying artistic circulation. Third, we find that the labels first used to describe artists, which drive forward their initial circulation, can continue to facilitate but also constrain the circulation of their work at a later stage. And we suggest 4 types of labels are at work: aesthetic, ethnic or identity, geographic, and ideological. So by that I mean when an exhibition is termed something like post-colonial, thereby signifying an ideological stance. And lastly, we focus on the role of government policy as a catalyst or impediment to global cultural decentering. Let me say a little bit more about the words that we use before moving on. We use the word decentering because we're interested in understanding not only how a broader range of theories and content might get included in the global cultural and intellectual worlds, but also how to diversify the individuals, disciplines, institutions, and geographies where they are produced. We find that particular cultural brokers play an important role in decentering. We call these individuals vernacularizers to draw attention to the fact that they go beyond simple translation or transmission to make something comprehensible, appropriate, and useful as it travels from one context to another. 2 types of vernacularizers are important in the decentering of cultural worlds. The first are members of the transnational cultural and economic class, or the gatekeepers of the global cultural art and academic worlds. While many of these individuals are products of the global north, increasing numbers, while born in the global south, study, work, and live outside it. Because they move from place to place and carry the new tools they acquire from one place to another, they homogenize practices. Pedagogy, museology, and curation, to name a few, become more and more similar as these people move from place to place and carry an increasingly comparable toolkit with them. A second particularly important subset of transnational professionals are part of the national diaspora. They are the ethnic national scholars, art critics, and curators who now live and work outside their countries of origin, but still maintain strong personal and professional attachments to it, or are open to the overtures on the part of sending governments to do so. These individuals and the social networks they create strongly affect the breadth and depth of cultural circulation. So let me turn to Argentina. Because of Argentina's colonial history with Spain, its strong economic and political ties with Europe and England, and the many Argentines who still claim Spanish or Italian roots, the country has been strongly influenced by European intellectual and cultural life. Even today, many Argentines share a language, religion, and some cultural similarities with Europe and other parts of the Americas. Still, just as the Latin American literary boom was purposefully promoted by writers and publishers alike, so the recognition and expansion of markets for Argentine and Latin American art also had to be fostered. In the Argentine case, several key collectors and gallerists did this work of vernacularization. When Marianne Eppinger describes how she and her husband built their collection, her stories are filled with names of key vernacularizers in the Latin American and Latinx art worlds. Transnational curators and academics such as Mary Carmen Ramirez, who now works at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, Or Robert Storrs, the former dean of the Yale School of Art, she recalls, cut their teeth looking at her artworks. Mauro Herzliya, a collector, philanthropist, and gallery owner, understood that creating a vibrant, prestigious art scene required more than just producing interesting works of art. You need, he said, to document and archive exhibition catalogs. You need art historians who will use these materials to analyze and critique them. Towards this end, he founded the Espigas Foundation, a documentation center where such materials are collected and made available. He also created and ran Art Débat, the first major art fair in South America, and was instrumental in bringing the first Art Basel Cities project to Buenos Aires. Eppinger and Herzliya's efforts laid the foundation for a thriving art scene and also signaled to the world that Buenos Aires was open for business. Several important diasporic vernacularizers writing from inside and outside the country also play critical roles in heightening the prominence of art from the region. Inez Katzenstein is now the curator of Latin American art at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. In 2007, Andrea Junta, an art historian at the University of Buenos Aires, co-curated a major exhibition, Radical Women, Latin American Art, 1960 to 1985, which showed at the Brooklyn Museum in New York and the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. Both of these women promote new imaginaries, including spaces of cultural production that encompass Latin American and Latinx artists working in the US or the Global South as a region of vibrant interchange. They're rewriting art history by inserting radical women, decentering traditional centers of cultural power by creating new ones, and rewriting the metrics for evaluating success. The changing demography of the United States helps their cause. As the US moves closer to becoming a fully majority-minority country, these population shifts are pushing its cultural institutions to diversify their exhibitions and collecting practices. To survive and thrive, museums have to bring in the next generation of individuals who will produce, collect, and visit the art of the future. This means paying more attention to Latinx art, makers and art consumers, and bringing Latin American and Latinx cultural production under the same label. This regional reimagining got a boost from several key institutions such as the Getty Foundation and the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. Expanding the Latin American label to include Latinx artists makes it a broader, more visible category that's an identity, a geography, and a political position of solidarity with people of color throughout North and South America. Collectors are socialized into this imaginary through its embodiment in Art Basel Miami, the new go-to place for art buyers interested in the Spanish-speaking world. Note here that the national government plays a minimal fluctuating role in promoting cultural production and export, which changes depending upon which party is in power. It's the city government of Buenos Aires that brought Art Basel Cities and private investors who created Art Débat, in contrast to the case of Korea, which I'm now going to turn to, where there's a purposeful policy strategy to export Korean culture abroad. So the heightened presence of Korean cultural production on the global stage didn't begin until 1988, when a newly democratic Korea, whose economic fortunes were also on the rise, opened up fully to the world by hosting the Olympics in Seoul. Before that, Koreans rarely had passports or traveled abroad. A small number of artists who studied abroad, such as Nam June Paik and Park Se-bo, went to Japan. It was the rising prominence of the Korean wave, and said Literature and Translation Institute director Woo Han-yeon, that set the country's sights outside its own borders. From the Korean wave, he said, we have gained confidence that we're not just a small country on the far side of Asia, but that we can compete on the world stage. Aspirations for international fame in the art world grew with the meteoric rise of what became known as Dansei-kwa art. In the mid-1960s, a group of artists interested in struggles over national identity, belonging, and tradition began creating monochromatic works that ultimately took this name. Most worked valiantly, but in relative obscurity, with occasional shows in Asia until the early 2000s, when a perfect storm took shape. The new global focus of the art world, with its sights on emerging markets such as Asia, brought previously under-recognized artists and movements like Dansei-kwa into the spotlight. Professor Joan Key is a critical vernacularizer working from the diaspora in this story. Her book, Contemporary Korean Art, Dansekwa and the Urgency of Method, the first English language account of this movement, makes a compelling case for distinguishing Korean monochrome art from similar works made in Japan. Two major shows at the Kuchka Gallery in Seoul in August 2014 and less than a month later at the Blum and Poe Gallery in Los Angeles received a great deal of attention. As a result, several major institutions acquired Dansekwa works. Collectors took their cue from these international tastemakers, and the prices for Dansekwa skyrocketed. It was a no-holds-barred effort to create a national cultural product that differed from its Japanese and Chinese counterparts. While many of the most prominent contemporary Korean artists today, including Haegi Young and Do Hosa, do not work in the Dansekwa tradition, this aesthetic label brought attention to the geographic one. The art world became interested in all things Korean, and Korean cultural producers were more than willing to create accordingly. State and private companies and foundations all play a role in advancing the national cause. As the country became known for K-pop and television dramas, the government put in place an extensive set of strategies to promote Korean culture abroad. It often does so through public-private partnerships with Korean corporations and with help from diasporic vernacularizers. The Hyundai Corporation is a case in point. It entered into an 11-year partnership with the Tate Modern Museum in London, which includes the yearly Hyundai Commission in the museum's Turbine Hall and the creation of the Hyundai Transnational Research Center, both efforts to make sure that art from beyond the US and Europe gets put on display. These examples speak to the important role that diasporic vernacularizers play in promoting and interpreting Korean culture. Annika Yi, who won the Hyundai Commission in 2021, is Korean-born but now lives and works in New York City. Suk-Hyung Lee, also Korean-born, directs the Tate Transnational Research Center. Joan Key was educated and teaches in the US. Even if these individuals are not predisposed to the cause, they are often attracted by the money and resources the Korean government makes available to support it, funding for research, exhibitions, residencies, or events, which is just too hard to resist. So let me conclude. Scholarly interest in cultural globalization is on the rise as the neoliberalization and marketization of the artistic, literary, and music worlds increases in conjunction with our heightened global connectedness through technology and market expansion. But to date, much of this scholarship still treats cultural globalization as a tug of war between an admittedly more diverse group of centers and peripheries. In this picture, peripheral cultural locals are assumed to be receivers of central norms rather than producers and disseminators of norms in their own right. We build on this work, but also extend it by empirically studying how global cultural decentering works through 4 factors: artist physical migration, the interventions of vernacularizers, labeling, and policymaking. It is true that many members of the early generation of contemporary artists left their countries of origin voluntarily or by force in order to gain international recognition. We find, however, that once these circulatory pathways are established, physical movement is not a prerequisite for traversing them. Instead, the role of vernacularization and labeling becomes more prominent for the circulation of work, and it's broadening to a more diverse set of destinations over time. In each of our country cases, there are key vernacularizers working from, in, and outside the country who communicate and make legible the exigencies of the world outside the nation to those who aspire to have their work exhibited and collected there. They help educate and socialize new audiences throughout the global North and South about art and culture produced in previously unknown places or unfamiliar places. They often do so through labeling, using identity, geographic, aesthetic, or ideological markers that set this work apart and makes it visible in new ways, both enabling and constraining for future circulation. But although labels can create clearly identifiable clusters of artists, such as the post-war generation in Lebanon, they can also constrain, consigning artists to do the same kind of work about the same kinds of topics for which they've become known. We don't mean to suggest that all of the artists in our sample have shifted their sights away from the traditional centers of cultural power. What we do argue, however, is that a significant number of are creating alternative pathways and institutions that lead to new destinations in a more decentered cultural landscape. It remains to be seen whether these efforts add up to a new sustainable vision for cultural production and dissemination, and that even if they do, they'll be able to stand firm against the ever powerful presence of economic values in the art market. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that paper, Peggy. I know I want to do the everyone can do the virtual clapping. One thing I should have said is that if folks have questions, we're going to take those through the chat. So please feel free to add questions throughout the presentations to the chat, and then I'll kind of bundle them together and feed them back to the presenters. But I just want to say thanks again, Peggy, for that paper. I think it's so interesting to see the ways in which you're pulling out those specific actors and those specific networks in these broader trans and international networks. So I think it's really important work to help us think about how these things actually unfold. So our next speaker is going to be Jérémie Molho, and he's going to speak about urban policy modeling and diversity governance in Doha and Singapore.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sheryl-Ann, and thank you very much to the organizers for this very interesting conference. I was very happy to listen to the previous session and also, of course, to this session. So thanks, and I will start now my presentation on urban policy modeling and diversity governance in Doha and Singapore. So I wanted to start by reminding how at the start of the pandemic, Singapore went from 1 week to the next, from being considered as the gold standard of pandemic response to being criticized for the poor treatment of its migrant worker populations. And at the time, many observers made a comparison with Gulf cities where migrants endured similar fates, housed in overcrowded and segregated housing facilities where infections spread quickly. And this crisis followed a series of events that have recurrently highlighted the contradictions that lie behind these global cities' successful models and their branding strategies promoting their rich diversity. So this raises the question of how these cities deal with these contradictions and how it affects the way they manage their diversity. So the objective of this presentation is to analyze the role of policy modeling in shaping urban diversity governance. By urban policy modeling, what I intend is the way in which local policies are developed in connection with policies developed in distant locations. And this research is based on fieldwork I have conducted in Doha and Singapore since 2018, with interviews of policymakers and stakeholders of diversity governance, and analysis of their public statement in policy documents and in the media. In this presentation, I will argue that the modeling of urban diversity policies goes along with a compartmentalized diversity governance, whereby distinct forms and understandings of diversity are framed and managed in a differentiated way. Here is the outline of the presentation, where I will first start with the theoretical developments and then develop the empirical cases on Doha and Singapore. So first, about urban modeling. The literature on urban diversity modeling tends to correspond to two main perspectives. On the one hand, progressive urban diversity modeling studies look at how local actors collaborate to address the challenges that minorities and migrants face in cities, often in the face of restrictive national policies. And on the other hand, the critical study of neoliberal urban diversity modeling traces the genealogies of dominant policy rationales, which influence local diversity policies and promote a selective and elitist understanding of diversity. This disconnect between different kinds of diversity governance scripts can be thought to contribute to a compartmentalization of diversity governance on a local level. The notion of compartmentalization is used in psychology to designate defense mechanisms in which thoughts and feelings that seem to conflict and be incompatible are isolated from each other, in separate and apparently impermeable compartments. And research shows that it is used as a way to avoid and distort and deny negative self-beliefs. Urban diversity governance systems are characterized by tensions between antagonistic ideas, including colorblind and supposedly neutral approaches, diversity celebration logics that promote diversity as a positive resource for cities, and critical perspectives that emphasize structural inequalities. The compartmentalization of diversity governance consists in the coexistence of these contradictory diversity philosophies. It has an organizational and a spatial dimension. First, organizations within the city get assigned the management of different kinds of diversities. They operate in parallel instead of trying to compromise. And second, the differentiated understanding of diversity is projected on the urban space, where different modes of representation of diversity can be highlighted. Doha and Singapore both have evolved from model importers to model fabric. During the post-independence years, they hired British and American planners to design the city. In Doha, from the mid-90s, new institutions were created like Qatar Foundation, Qatar Museums, to develop ambitious projects to promote the city on the world stage. And the many foreigners, expert that work in these institutions are now asked to adapt to the local model and be part of the construction of an original city model. Singapore has been widely promoted as an urban model, in particular in the field of economic development and urban planning. And Singaporean firms are now invited around the world to sell the city-state's model. Three factors create a sense of urban antecedents for the city's urban governance model, diversity governance model. First, both cities, due to their long history as trading hubs and their status as magnets of various migration flow, constitute highly diverse cities. Foreign nationals represent respectively 95% and 35% of the workforce in Doha and Singapore. And the official narratives in both cities frame their high-level integration into global flows as part of their identity. Second, their diversity discourse is closely tied to their willingness to top world city rankings. Doha and Singapore have both risen in a relatively short time as key hubs in the global economy, and recently ranked first and fourth in per capita GDP. And both cities have mobilized culture to construct their status as global hubs. And this strategy relies on centrally elaborated plans and on the establishment of highly visible, internationally connected cultural infrastructures. Finally, they offer best practices through their active investments in culture, sport, higher education, and have set up initiatives that stimulate intercultural dialogue on the regional and global scales. For example, Qatar Museums, which develop exhibitions with partners around the world and present itself as national link between civilizations, or Singapore's celebration of festivals of the different Singaporean communities, such as the Malay Hari Raya, the Chinese New Year, or the Hindu Festival of Light, which is presented as a way to showcase Singapore's unique historical roots and ties to the rest of Asia. But underneath this image of diversity management model lies a compartmentalized diversity governance framework divided along lines of tensions. First, as the global city literature has stressed, these cities show high levels of polarization between privileged elite and marginalized working class. And in addition, there's a contrast in both cities between, on the one hand, an increased recognition of the city's old diversity, the celebration of the migration heritage of the national population, and on the other hand, the increasing logic of exclusion of new diversity, in particular low-skilled migrant workers. Deriving from these lines of tension, four compartments that structure the diversity governance in Doha and Singapore. First, a first compartment refers to the diversity of the national population and relies on a fixed identity discourse. It appears in national museums, in national commemorations, and underpins the planning of the city. Singapore, since its independence, has promoted a multicultural model with continuous efforts to promote a common national identity while promoting the identity of the three main officially recognized ethnic groups, Chinese, Malay, and Indians. The creation of heritage district for each community displays this multicultural character, while at the same time, the public housing policy applies a quota system to prevent the formation of ethnic enclaves. The Qatari population is composed of different groups that relate to their migration origins, but the emphasis in the national narrative is more on the unity of the Qatari identity and on the Arab Bedouin identity. This identity is projected through the creation of tourism-oriented heritage districts like Souk Market. A second compartment pushes the understanding of the city identity towards a more sophisticated understanding of the nation's diversity. And it is mobilized to brand the city as cosmopolitan. In Singapore, the cultural institutions and art organizations that operate within conserve their ethnic heritage districts try to transgress the logic of self-exoticization and perpetuation of the colonial imaginary that has characterized the planning of these districts by stressing the complexity within each official ethnic category, as well as the intense intercultural relations that were taking place in these neighborhoods. In Doha, the efforts to push the boundaries of the national identity discourse towards an enhanced recognition of its diversity can be found in the ongoing project of Mushayred, which includes an area of 4 conserved houses turned into museums, where in particular the Bin Jalmud house deals with the city's past as node of slave trade and displays testimonies of Qataris of African descent. A third compartment targets elite migrants, and it relies on the provision of spectacular amenities like those of Doha's Corniche or Singapore's Marina Bay, as well as the creation of creative clusters to offer inspiring spaces where mobile creative individuals can thrive and innovate, like Science Park in Singapore or Education City in Doha. And to be attractive to these mobile migrants, they create elite consumption spaces like Dempsey Hill in Singapore or the Pearl in Doha that use cosmopolitan discourses as a way to brand high-end and exclusive spaces. A fourth compartment targets the low-skilled migrants, especially those employed in manufacture and construction, who have been the object of strategies of planned segregation. In Singapore, foreign workers who used to live at workplace sites or in rented public housing flats were progressively housed in separate dormitories. In Doha, historically, migrants settled in the historical center in buildings that were vacated along with the modernization of the city. But from the 2000s, the regeneration of the historic center went along with the relocation of migrants in peripheral areas. Paradoxically, this movement was further accentuated by the international coverage on the conditions of living of migrant workers. Segregated migrant housing was not just a way to reduce the visibility of migrant workers, it was also promoted as a way to provide better living conditions and culturally specific amenities. In Singapore, the riots that took place in Little India in 2013, which involved migrant workers, generated international coverage and local controversies on the living conditions of migrant workers. And after this event, Singapore planned mega dormitories able to host up to 25,000 workers, comprising leisure facilities such as cinemas and cricket fields. At the same period, Doha faced a lot of critiques and scrutiny after its awarding of the World Cup. And in 2015, it released a plan to build 7 new cities to house 250,000 labor workers. The developer of the so-called Asian city promoted it as designed and developed to strategically meet the vision of Qatar 2022 World Cup, assuring better living conditions for the workforce. And it emphasized the presence of recreation areas, cricket stadiums, and cinemas showing Bollywood movies. So to conclude, What I've tried to show is that Doha and Singapore's aspiration to appear as a model favors a compartmentalized diversity governance approach. One of the consequences of this diversity governance approach is to restrict any progress in terms of diversity recognition to specific compartments only accessible to small portion of the population, and thereby preventing wider social impacts. The COVID crisis has challenged the narrative of cosmopolitan openness promoted in these modeling strategies. In Singapore, due to the detrimental effects that the pandemic had on the economy, many measures were put in place to further restrict foreign employment. And in both cities, it put their management of migrant workers in the spotlight, revealing long-standing problems. The separate and overcrowded migrant houses became high-risk zones where the virus started to spread. In both cities, it's led the government to quarantine the whole dormitory or camp areas. Yet, we see an overall defense of the model by the respective governance. In Singapore, the government announced that 11 new dormitories were to be built to house 100,000 more workers, putting forward improvements in terms of density and hygiene to prevent future outbreaks. In Doha, reports of Amnesty International stressing migrant workers trapped in overcrowded camps are not being bailed and expelled without due judiciary process were met with government PR emphasizing efforts to distribute food, masks, and sanitizers to workers and ensure salary payments. So this overall suggests that these recent controversies in both cities are inclined, both cities are inclined to stick to this compartmentalized diversity governance approach. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much for that really thought-provoking talk. I got to read the longer paper, so I was really struck by the way that you started the longer paper as well, and just sort of the images of what you talked about right at the end, that contrast between kind of the ways in which cities are using this kind of cultural production to really highlight and model that they are these sort of model cities, but then the ways in which people are actually experiencing some of this modeling in everyday life. And I think that idea of compartmentalization is really fruitful to help us think about these juxtapositions. So thank you for that. There's some great questions in the chat already, so folks can keep on adding those. And then after our third speaker, we'll all get back together and we'll have an opportunity to pose them to our speakers. So our third and final talk for this panel is by Peter Scholten, and he's going to be talking about cities of migration, theorizing the diversity of urban diversities in Europe. So we're going to another continent. It's great.
Thank you very much, Sheryl-Ann, and indeed, we're taking us to another continent, back to Europe. So, greetings to everyone from a late evening in Europe, and I want to say a big thanks also to Sheryl-Ann for chairing this session, and also to Sintu and to Anna, of course, for the excellent organization of this conference. It would have been so great to finally be able to join you in real life again in beautiful Toronto with the Cirque Institute, but I'm sure there will be more opportunities in the future. So without further ado, let me go to the presentation I've prepared on cities of migration. This is based on a project that I'm doing together with my dear colleague Asia Pizarevskaya, also from Erasmus University Rotterdam. It's a project that is in the final stages. So this is really the first sneak preview that we've ever given of what comes out of the project. And I ask also for your apologies beforehand for any unpolished first findings that I'm sharing with you, but I'm looking forward to your questions and feedback. And there's quite a good relation also with the earlier work presented by Peggy on cultural globalization, for instance, but also on Jérémie of models on diversity governance. And Jérémie, I haven't received your paper yet, but I really want to read it. There are a couple of links which I will link presentation. So the background of our research, of our projects. Let me close this, otherwise you see a black spot there. So we try to advance empirical and theoretical understanding of different forms of urban diversity. And why do we want to do that? Well, first, because we are still in migration studies, and I think in particular in the European form of migration studies, quite often stuck in this national container view, already pinned down by Ulrich Beck in 1992. Too often we study diversities and diversity governance in terms of distinct national models. And we forget that sometimes variation within a country, between cities in one country, can be very significant. And sometimes cities in different countries, but with similar backgrounds, like port cities like Marseille, Barcelona, Naples, Rotterdam, may have far more in common than their geographical position may suggest. But another point that is behind our project is try to look beyond global cities. We have seen that in the literature, there are many studies on global cities, on really what Glixiller and Chaglar have called the top scale cities. So cities on the top in terms of global economic positioning. If you look at the literature, there's a strong focus on those cities, whereas most cities are not global cities, and migration is an urban phenomenon, but by and large, it is concentrated in cities that are not necessarily global cities. And we haven't really explored those non-global cities and cities of other sizes, so medium-sized, small-sized cities. We haven't really explored them in sufficient detail, we believe. So we share that with Nina and with Aisha, that we want to go beyond global cities, and also with Nancy Foner and her colleagues, that we want to develop a more differentiated understanding of the complexity of diversities at the local level. So really discard the idea that there would be a one-size-fits-all, so one urban model or one model to which most cities would tend towards or even aspire towards. So we want to appreciate the complexity, appreciate the diversity of cities. So this is just a little bit of literature background research that we did in 10 years of academic publishing in selected journals working on areas related to migration and migration-related diversities. And this is just to put a little bit of beef to the argument that if you see the number of articles that include case studies of, for instance, New York, is well, that's the most popular city to study in terms of Prisma mentioned, so 63. And if you look at this top 10, there's New York, London, Los Angeles, Toronto, Amsterdam, Antwerp. So it's not so Eurocentric as we expected, but it is at least Western culture centric, North America and Europe. But we often see references to the same cities. And if you look to the table at the right, there you see almost an embarrassing focus on Europe, US, and Canada, and very little work of the type that Peggy and Jérémie have been doing by really systematically looking at other type of cities. I have to admit that in my project, we could also only focus on Europe. I have to say that it's also a budgetary matter and a data matter, but our aspiration is really to look beyond European cities. And well, Jérémie, you can look forward to a mail from our side, because I feel that there are great opportunities for collaboration in that regard. So this is really, well, substantiating our argument that we want to reach beyond global citiesism, or whatever that means, at least beyond the idea that our findings from the vast majority of studies in global cities can always be extrapolated or projected upon other types of cities. So we really want to look beyond that. So. Then, in our efforts to try to theorize urban diversities, what we first do is try to systematically map and analyze what types of urban diversity do we come across in different types of cities. And then we mean not only the volume of diversity, we also mean the diversity of diversity, yeah? the super diversity or complexity of diversity argument. So from how many different backgrounds do migrants come? For instance, a big difference between Germany and some other countries, where in Germany there are a couple of migrant populations that are quite strongly represented, whereas in a city like London, but also in a city like Rotterdam, there is a very vast rainbow of communities of very different backgrounds. And then we try to, in the next stage of the research, we try to systematically then study what may be related to these different types of urban diversity. So what type of histories of migration, types of migration, levels of migration, what type of inequalities in cities, what type of political factors may be associated with particular diversity configuration. So hypothetically, it can also, or theoretically, it can also mean that we may find that some cities in terms of urban diversity are indeed super diverse, in the sense that a lot of the scholars have described it. And then we try to find out, so why are specific types of cities super diverse, and why perhaps not other cities? Why do other cities have another configuration of diversity? Does that have something to do with urban governance and politics? Does it have something to do with inequality structures within these cities, or with city-specific histories of migration? And that way we really try to come with a more multi-scalar, more differentiated approach towards understanding the diversity of urban diversities. So here's our first take. Unfortunately, was not only funds that kicked in a project like ours, but it was also data availability and ethical reasons. So first of all, we didn't want to study data on so-called second-generation migrants. We only wanted to have data based on foreign-born. So is somebody born outside of the country where somebody is living in? So first-generation migrants in European jargon. And then we needed data that was also comparable. And in Europe, as you may know, there is a lot of data, but data isn't really comparable. It has very different backgrounds and a lot of data problems. So we ended up only with 4 countries: Germany, France, Italy, and the Netherlands. And there we could legitimate that we have a meaningful comparison. And then we try to compare them based on diversity, a Simpson's diversity index, and a segregation index. And we plotted all cities from all those 4 countries. We plotted them on a big map to see how much variation there actually is in terms of either diversification or segregation. And there we came already with 4 clusters of cities. And we try to build on those clusters. So from those clusters, we selected median cities from each of the 4 countries, which means that we ended up with 16 countries for more in-depth qualitative research, where we did interviews, document research, literature research also. For cities, for cluster 1, cities with high diversity and low segregation, cities with high diversity, high segregation, including my own city, Rotterdam, cities with low diversity and low segregation, and cities with low diversity and high segregation. So we took 4 cities from each, and then really embarked on a mission to understanding why may these cities be in those clusters. How can we really understand that? Is that just a coincidence, or is there a pattern? And a pattern that goes beyond the the old idea of national models, and also a pattern that goes beyond the size of the cities. Because if I go one step back here in this map, we could already see that the relationship between size and type of diversity was surprisingly weak. We also see big cities that are relatively little segregated and have low diversity. So there was some relationship, but not very strong. So size matters, but is not really determinative. So then to go to the 4 clusters in our first take on the findings from our qualitative research. So one type that we see emerging, and it's a type where we have difficulty with coming to a label. So if anybody can come with great suggestions, I am very open to that. So far, we have called them the middle class or differentiated cities of migration. These are cities with high diversity and low segregation, including cities like Parma here on the picture, but also Paris, a huge city, obviously, clearly, but also smaller cities like Constance or Hilversum. They have a very diversified economic opportunity structure, top scale, as Nina Glick-Schiller and Aija Chagdar would call them. Which means they're not just a working class city, they also have, for instance, the more high educated, high paid jobs. They have a very large variation of economic opportunity structures, but they certainly do not include only global cities. So top scale cities can be small cities as well. They have very long and diverse migration histories with labor migrants, refugee migrants, humanitarian migrants coming in different periods of their history, also making their contemporary diversity configuration accumulation of their long migration history. They usually have, surprisingly, relatively low inequalities in these cities, where low means that they are more average. They don't have a very exceptional income gap or spatial segregation in these cities. They are average in terms of inequalities, and they often have a very mainstreamed governance approach. So diversity is part of everything. It's mainstream. So migrant communities, migrant cultural histories, for instance, are mainstreamed in urban activities, and to link with Jérémie's talk, also mainstreamed in their city branding policies. They're part of how the city sees itself and also wants itself to be seen. Then a second type, which is an entirely different type, but also includes cities of varying sizes, including relatively large cities. We believe that type 2 cities of high diversity and high segregation, are often in our data set they are post-industrial cities of migration, which include here on the picture the city of Rotterdam, where I am from, where my university is from. These are cities which have evolved through their industrial development, bringing very specific types of migration, labor migration, and also in specific histories, in specific periods in their history, feeding also into often already existing inequalities in the city. For instance, what we saw in almost all post-industrial cities is that they have a clear segregation between working class and non-working class neighborhoods, which where migration has clearly echoed with. So migrants tended to settle in those neighborhoods that were traditionally the working class neighborhoods, leading to spatial segregation and also to lack of intercultural contact, like we have seen at a higher degree in the type 1 cities. So here we see some diversification going on now, with current migration often being a motor of their post-industrial transitions. And in terms of governance approaches, we see that these cities are also going through a transition from sometimes having a history of quite tough integrationist approaches. We saw that in in all 4 cities, even in the French city Nice, quite a strong history of really problematizing integration, having active government involvement, social interventionism in the cities, also in specific neighborhoods in particular, towards a more universalist governance approach where gradually diversity and migration become part of everything in these cities. So then tiny cities are, we think, new migration cities. They are low diversity, low segregation, cities like Viareggio, Rouen, Doetinchem, and the German city of Dessau-Roßlau, as here on the picture. And often migration here is a relatively new phenomenon connected to some new economic developments in these cities, which can be a new economy evolving, can be touristic developments taking place, can be like in the city of Doetinchem, the evolution of a city from having a more rural regional function towards more high-tech agricultural function, or in Dessau-Roßlau, technological innovation and the establishment of higher education institutions that also become a factor for migration. Usually the cities have low social economic inequalities, which may be reflected in low segregation and low diversity. They often tend to have center-left administration, and there we don't see, I mean, if we would think in terms of traditional causality, we don't know what direction it would go there. So does the center-left administration make sure that there's low segregation, or are cities with low segregation more likely to vote the center-left? We don't know. And we often see that the approach to diversities is still developing, often in a more targeted and integrationist way, but very modest, very modest. Then the last type are, I think, yeah, we call them, it now has a clearly negative connotation, but now we call them the left behind cities. Low diversity, high segregation, cities like Vannes, Plauen, Leeuwarden, Cosenza. Migration here is very limited, but there is usually some migration history in the city connected to some industrial or economic past of the city. And migration is then connected to that economic history, often a history of economic decline. So migrants sometimes find themselves in very vulnerable positions of having been employed in, for instance, like in Vannes, in economies and economic activities oriented at a rural region that have vanished, or in a touristic area that has emerged, has entered a period of decline. So these are often struggling cities where migrants, because they are particularly vulnerable. Yes. And,
sorry to interrupt you, but just in the interest of time, I know you're almost done, but maybe if you could take like another minute or so, that'd be perfect.
Yeah, I can wrap it up in a minute, Sheryl-Ann. That would be fine. So left behind cities here often have a center-right orientation and a strong integrationist approach. So let me speed a little bit through the next one. So this is apologies for the lack of powerful visualizations that will come in the course of the project, but this is a quick summary of what I just told and how we think we can position the 4 types. Then 2 conclusions. One is that we see cities moving around between types, like the city of Rotterdam has moved from being a left behind city to being a post-industrial city. And now in terms of diversification, moving more towards type 1, a more middle class or differentiated type. And then really the last words, the so what question on a theoretical level. So what we really the point that we really try to make is that we should reach beyond global citiesism. So we shouldn't take global cities as a model for all cities. There is no one size fits all. And in our contextualized approach, we find a couple of elective affinities. So one between the type of diversity configuration and type of urban governance. So there's no universal governance approach that fits everywhere. Different approaches tend to fit with different cities. We also see that a relationship between cities that have a higher degree of diversity and their life choosing a universalist policy approach. So this is something that we are writing on at this moment. We also see a relationship between segregation and other forms of urban inequalities. Not surprising, but very much substantiated now in our quantitative and qualitative research. And then, yeah, the big disclaimer at the end, more research is definitely required to move beyond the clusters and the theorization of these clusters to really come to the stage where we can say, well, these are types, and also types where we can then, well, substantiate that these are not just European types, so that we are not vulnerable to European cities-ism or whatever that would mean. So thank you very much for your attention, and sorry, Sheryl-Ann, for being a little bit long.
No, thank you so much. Jokingly, as you were talking, I was flashing back to, like, let's say a few years ago when I was doing my dissertation work and how much I wish that your book had existed then. So I feel very lucky for all the students that are going to have it to use in the future. Okay, so we've got a great pool of questions and folks can keep on adding those to the chat. I am going to use my chair's prerogative to just toss out a first question, though. I think one of the things that's really exciting about all of these papers, I mean, first of all, is really the ways in which you're dealing with scale in lots of different ways, and that came up in the last panel as well, that relationship between the nation state and the city, between cities themselves, between regions, between individual actors and non-state actors. So I think that's so exciting. And I think one of the kind of, you know, as we say in English, like chicken and egg questions, that idea of like which one came first, that I think a lot of us are trying to deal with, is that, you know, a lot of the papers talk about kind of the economic role of immigration and the economic role of culture and immigration, right? That tie between them. You know, Peggy, whether that's sort of very obvious in your paper, but also Jérémie thinking about the idea of models, you know, Peter, your paper talking about the difference between industrialized cities, between these global cities. So I'm curious if you could just kind of, this isn't a real question, I'm mostly just asking you to like do some work for me, but I'm wondering if you could kind of talk about that relationship and what you think studying immigration helps us to understand about, say, social policy in cities, or helps us to understand about these economic processes. What does studying immigration help us to understand in terms of the city more broadly? I'm tempted to call on Peggy just because, you know, to go in the same order, but I don't know if you want to start us off.
I'd really like to hear someone else answer that first, because I'm not sure I get the question.
Well, I think, well, I mean, thinking about your work specifically, I mean, I think it's such an interesting to think about trying to understand, you know, this international world of cultural production through immigration. Like I was just really struck by that. So I guess in some ways I'm curious if you have, you know, something that you think that thinking through this through immigration kind of helps us to better understand that world of international cultural production. What does it kind of, what does it add or give to us, if that makes sense?
Well, I think the story is all about migration in ways that we don't think about it usually. So, you know, that's the whole idea about these diasporic vernacularizers, who are these very well positioned people who, you know, sometimes have a very progressive change agenda about really changing the hierarchy of the global cultural world, and sometimes are all about getting into the traditional centers of power. But, you know, those folks plus the how much movement is required of an artist or a writer to get attention to begin with. There's just all kinds of migration in my story that we don't usually think about as migration scholars.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Jérémie or Peter, I don't know, that sort of that chicken and the egg between the sort of social policy, between economic policy and change, and immigration. So what studying immigration helps us to understand of the city more broadly? Again, I'm just asking you to do work for me, so.
Would you like to go first, Jérémie? I've already been talking a lot. I'm not sure whether Jérémie can hear us. Shall I chip in?
No, there we go.
Jérémie?
Yeah, can you
Yeah. Well, so in terms of your paper, right, I was really struck, right, by the way that when you talk about compartmentalization, you talked about the ways in which these cities have been using diversity as almost a selling point, right? But then on the other hand, of course, the everyday experience of the immigrants who aren't part of that sort of the celebrated part of immigration, right? They're having to deal with that everyday life. So I guess I'm trying to think about, for you, right, thinking about immigration specifically, what does it help you to understand in terms of sort of the development of these cities? Or what would your sort of message be to the folks branding the cities and developing the cities that comes from studying their patterns of immigration?
Yeah, I mean, the topic that I'm developing in this paper about modeling actually has been a lot developed in other fields than diversity promotion, for mega projects, especially for promotion of local environmental policies or these kinds of other policy sectors. And actually less for understanding the way in which the city is developing specific strategies towards its various populations, both in terms of speaking of its identity, working on its history as a migration hub, and on the management of its current population. So I think that's what I'm trying to do, is to also to see how these kinds of processes that we see in other kinds of policies can be also applied to this aspect, and how maybe it differs also maybe in a certain way.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. And then Peter, I don't know if you had any thoughts. I was thinking specifically as you were talking about your typologies and sort of, folks in rural work versus industrialized work and middle class work. I was thinking about, what does that help us to think about in terms of economic development in the city?
Yeah. No, I think, it tells us that cities are all about migration, as Peggy said. The story is all about migration, but in very different ways. And that we have only started to understand in what different ways, in what different cities. So Sheryl-Ann, you also refer to social policies. I think that's a very powerful example where those policies will differ significantly between post-industrial cities and left behind cities on the one hand, and the more differentiated or middle class cities on the other hand. And sometimes migration can also hurt. We could see that, for instance, in the left behind cities, the topic of labor market competition was really visible there. You can see that also in terms of contestation and a little bit of conflict in these cities, whereas in post-industrial cities and in differentiated cities, there the thesis that we read a lot in literature on global cities really applies, that when these cities are doing well, there is a lot of migration going on. So rather than migration being problematized, if you look at it historically, every time in the city of Rotterdam or in Paris, the city is doing well, you see a lot of migration. And in the periods where in Rotterdam, for instance, sometimes romanticized by populist parties, as the periods where the old Rotterdam, so to say, romanticized. Those were actually periods of extreme economic decline and retraction of the city. Those were not nice days. High unemployment, uncertain futures, and then very little migration in those periods. So there also the chicken and the egg. It goes both ways. And that's not just social policy, that's also the creative sector, for instance. We can see in post-industrial cities that Jérémie's type of creative cities, I very much see that in these post-industrial cities with popular youth culture, for instance. So there is not just some organization for communities or some big mainstream aesthetic establishments like in the super diverse cities. Now there, you really see that popular youth culture in a city like, let me use my own city again as example, that's safest, so that I don't make any mistakes. There, that culture is being carried by people with migrant backgrounds, like in Glickschiller's recent work on migrant city makers. You really see that in that type of city, but I think you'll see that less in the other types. Perhaps.
I think that's such a great point, that relationship between cultures, and it actually ties into the first question for Peggy. There was kind of a cluster of questions that I'll bundle together, but one person just kind of asked how you operationalize the term artist, and so that idea of whether or not you were thinking about, for example, more vernacular art, or thinking about, let me make sure that I get Rika's question correct. Also, thinking about craft and those kinds of art forms as well. And then more generally, there was also a question about whether or not you saw this relationship, or whether or not you were thinking about the relationship between like visual art as opposed to literature or music. Nick in particular points out that idea of literature and that sort of similarity of like the hubs. For example, New York is a literature hub, or Berkeley Arts is a music hub. So that relationship between different kinds of artists and different kinds of art.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. Thank you for them. This is a study of art and literature that is produced and visible in the art market as, ranked. So I'm not studying craft, I'm not studying artists that are not in that sort of gallery museum circuit. It would be a really interesting study to do, but I'm just trying to understand sort of what enables artists and writers from what have been not cultural centers enter into this global art and literary world. And the questions about the cross-fertilization are definitely at work. So there's a lot of similarities about how the pathways and the labels and the infrastructures that categorize each of these different forms of cultural production double or enable each other. So even the idea of the Korean wave as something that people recognize. I mean, there were a lot of comments in my fieldwork about how students want to go to Korea now to study Korean language, so that because they're so excited by the Korean, K-pop and also the K-dramas. And so there is this kind of it doesn't totally map on, the labels don't totally map on, the infrastructures don't totally map on, but the fact that they're there and draw attention to cultural production from each of these parts of the world is certainly a catalyst, I would say.
Well, I think that ties into another sort of set of questions that were asked about your paper, and it's the role and the relationship between your your vernacular, gosh, my brain is just falling, but your sort of vernacular actors, and especially the diasporic vernacular actors, and sort of thinking about the ways in which they kind of frame and filter, right, which pieces of culture count. So for example, Lizzie asks, to what extent do diasporic vernaculators help to reinforce national borders or dismantle them? And then, thinking about that idea of, Argentina, for example, having that kind of that reputation of high culture because of European roots, that story around Argentina, how or if these vernaculators are kind of reinforcing some of these kinds of hierarchies. And then also thinking about capital cities as well, but that's maybe a different question.
Right, so Anna asked a question about, is this about the nation or about the city? And I meant to put a piece in the paper about that, because in both Korea and Argentina, there have been efforts to decentralize artistic production away from Buenos Aires and away from Seoul, and it hasn't worked. And so it really is a story about these cities rather than the nation, although particularly in the Korean case, the Korean state plays a really big role in all of this, and less so in the Argentine case, and more vacillating, depend upon who's in power, right? But in terms of the other question about the role of vernacularizers, I would say that, in certain cases, they are all about reinforcing the nation and promoting this national cultural product that's going to circulate. But then in each case, there's another group, and it's too simplistic to say one group or the other. It's much more complicated than this, but just to give it in shorthand for this short time that I have, there's one group that is all about strengthening the nation, the visibility and the recognition and the circulation of the national cultural product and getting it into the traditional centers of power. And then there's another group, and it varies. So in Lebanon, part of that is wanting to go to France, and part of that is about wanting to go to some kind of global South, new set of centers and opportunities and possibilities. And then in Argentina, it's part of it's about still wanting to go to Europe and Spain in particular. And then part of it is this Latin American Latinx trajectory, which is for some people a post-colonial project. So there is a recentering and a decentering going on in each of my cases. And with Korea, it's a turn away from Japan and China and a turn towards the West. And some people will say, I do not want to take I don't want to be part of the government's project of promoting Korean art in this very nationalistic way. And then others, they're more comfortable with sort of taking the resources and then using them for their own, to put their own vision out in the world, I'd say.
I really that framing of decentering and recentering, right? That idea that again there's a diversity of diversities within your work as well, I think is really exciting. And again, I think it speaks to the importance and the interest of kind of pulling apart these actors, right, to really understand how these processes actually unfold, which is really exciting. Jérémie, I have a couple of questions from folks. One of the questions that was, sorry, I want to make sure I can get as many of them in as possible in the time we have left. But one of the questions that somebody asked was about the idea of the connection between the two cases. So Rika asked, thinking about the experience from the National University of Singapore, they'd say that the Doha-Singapore connection is interesting in that we've seen another aspect of transnationality, in that Singaporean firms have a lot of projects in Doha that become a conduit of another sort for another type of expat, the new non-Western ones. So I think that question of like the relationship between them, and also that question of like what kinds of new expats and immigrant residents those connections might be producing. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting point, but yeah, I mean it's something that I've been able to trace in a relatively punctual way. But I wouldn't say in a very systematic way. I mean, there has been historically some inspiration from in Doha, especially from the Singapore model. That's definitely something that we can see. But then in terms of actual selling of the Singapore model in specific projects and things like this, I mean, I've seen some kind of punctual connections, like individuals who belong to boards in the two cities, or these kinds of things. You can see these kinds of things happening. But then, yeah, I mean, this is something that I would probably need to look at more, actually.
Yeah, thank you so much. A comment from Sorry. A comment from John Carlisle was just a thank you for the great presentation, but then also that idea of, and you mentioned, you sort of mentioned colonialism and that kind of popped up. But John sort of talks about the idea of a critique of diversity and multiculturalism discourses that have happened for a while, is that idea of the ways in which those discourses obscure some of those underlying social realities in different societies. And so turning the comment into a question, I think one of the things that's really exciting is that, this idea of theorizing diversity, theorizing colonialism, again, outside of global North or outside of sort of Western perspectives. And so I'm wondering if there's anything that you're learning from looking at Singapore or Doha that you think kind of adds or shifts the way that we should be thinking about these, these kinds of thrown about terms, right, of diversity, of multiculturalism, of colonialism.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that the Singapore model has been promoted as a multicultural model very, very clearly, and that yeah, there hasn't been the same level of backlash on the notion of multiculturalism itself, I would say, than that we can see, for example, in Europe, I would say. But at the same time, I think it's also in terms of it's also in terms of trying to more make it more complex. That there has been a sense that there was that this multicultural model was something that was really imposed, and that a lot of people were also frustrated that some aspects of their own identities, even if they belonged to one of the key ethnic groups that were promoted, was being erased because they belonged to certain communities within the broad categories that weren't talked about. So I mean, in a way, I would say that the kinds of debates that emerged there were quite different from the kinds of debates that we've seen in like former colonial empires that received migration from their former colonies, so I would say that in this way, maybe that's the way it's useful also to try to see that there are different patterns of diversification, and that the notion of multiculturalism is not just one. There is not just one way of understanding it, and a lot of the debates that we have maybe in these kinds of contexts maybe should also be decentered and trying to look at the kinds of stories and debates and tensions that are happening elsewhere also.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. Peter, there's a cluster of questions for you that were sort of first centered around kind of almost methods-y kinds of questions. But Jan wanted to know how you measured segregation in your research, sort of in which domains, and then related, Jens asks what you saw, or how you guys measure the difference between segregation and inequality. And then sort of pushing it a little bit further, that idea of kind of how we're, maybe I'll shift the question a little bit to be a little bit more Canadian maybe, but the question of sort of how or what the kind of costs or benefits of these indexes might be, especially in terms of thinking about how they might oversimplify the situation, thinking about, how do you think about these as independent variables, let alone thinking about them across different countries.
Yeah, thank you, Sheryl-Ann. And was also just having a look at the chat, so a lot of questions. So sorry that I can't do justice to all of them. But thanks for very useful, very helpful questions. Yeah, the methods type of questions. So we used a segregation index, where we looked at a residential zip code level, to what extent there is an equal distribution of people from different countries of origin across the neighborhood. So we calculated a segregation index based on that data for all 4 countries. And only for these 4 countries could that be made comparable. So we had the data for all of Europe. It was almost all of it was useless. Only for 4 countries it really worked. Then the difference between segregation and inequalities. The segregation for me was just the indexy, the segregation index. So is there a more or less equal distribution of people who are foreign born across the urban population? So that's the only thing we looked at there. It was indeed not social segregation, it was really spatial segregation on the housing market. And inequalities for us is a concept that we only use in our qualitative research. So then it can be economic inequalities, can be educational inequalities. We looked at that reportings on that from the country. So we didn't quantify that concept further. We tried to see whether there's a meaningful relationship or a relationship that we could make sense of between these different types of inequalities and segregation, but also between these inequalities and types or degrees of diversity in a city. And the cost and benefits of index. Our intention is not at all to come with a new index of diversity in the city. So I'm sorry if I gave that impression. No, even to the contrary, we first, rather than developing an index, we wanted to map variation in diversity between cities, because we have a feeling that it's often a little bit simplified, as if cities all have similar configuration of diversity. So then it's good to put in the quantitative data, show the variation, and it was huge. It was even far more than we expected, but I also told that there was not a clear relationship between size and where the city is in these 4 types. But that was also the only thing. And then we mapped it. So then we have the clusters. We find typical cities for the clusters. And then we don't work with an index. Then we try to qualitatively further analyze and understand why are these cities there. And that can, of course, be a coincidence that we don't find anything, but we were finding relevant explanations for why cities were in a specific cluster because of what I told, whether they're industrial history, whether they have a very long, varied migration history, only a recent migration history. So we were step by step trying to make sense of it.
So Peter, that's actually really helpful, that division between sort of the way that you dealt with things quantitatively and qualitatively. There's another kind of cluster of questions that come together that kind of talk about the character of the cities themselves, I guess I would say. So for example, one person asked about whether or not you looked at kind of the housing structures within the city. Another person asked about that question of sort of neighborhood peripheries. Someone else asked about, Ngozi asked about the migrant refugee advisory boards in Germany. So whether or not you saw other kind of city-based institutions that were also sort of shifting this typology. So I guess if you could just talk a little bit about those institutions within the city.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I saw indeed also that last question, Sheryl-Ann, also related to the advisory board and to agency, where indeed that is a factor that we looked at in our qualitative research, where we saw that the more diverse cities, so type 1, type 2, the post-industrial cities and the more diversified cities, see a lot of agency. And related to Jérémie's presentation, for instance, we saw a lot of agency of migrants in popular youth culture in type 2 cities, in the post-industrial cities. That was really exciting, something that we did know from American literature, from Baltimore, Cleveland, and these type of cities, but not really, I hadn't seen it here. We haven't studied it further, we just observed it and then tried to, so that's one point. Yeah, we did look at housing market in our qualitative policy analysis. We see also that there's a difference in housing market policies between different type of cities, where especially the post-industrial cities, because of their industrial history, they are very active in social housing, for instance, traditionally very strong, whereas the diversified cities, the middle-class cities, were less active in that regard. In the Netherlands and Germany, they sometimes needed to be forced by government national government in order to open up more. And that is that doesn't say only something about the city, that also has implications for migration-related diversities and intercultural contact in those cities. Because cities with more social housing in segregated neighborhoods had less intercultural contacts. And that was really a pattern that we did find indeed. And then you did mention a third question, Sheryl-Ann.
Yeah, I think it was housing.
So I answered
and you mentioned that idea of like the contact and questions of like, you know, the peripheries in the cities, thinking about just how cities are organized, and then the institutions. Yeah, in the post-industrial cities, we really see that migrants were pushed into the periphery, because those were there. That was where the working class neighborhoods were. In the port cities, usually those neighborhoods were somewhere far away from the center, near port industries, and those also became then the migrant neighborhoods in those post-industrial cities. So you see this historic continuity there that was spotted. Yeah, that's so interesting. I love it. I work in a geography department, so I'm feeling all the feels right now. We're a little bit over time, but thankfully we're the last panel of the day, so we can sneak a little bit over time. But I wanted to toss out just a question for all. Well, I want to toss out two questions. The first is specifically for Peggy, but then for all of our panelists. You know, our panel was this idea of kind of looking from above, and so we're definitely looking a lot more kind of institutions and thinking about these in really like broad comparative ways. But one of the questions that came up that was specifically for Peter, but I kind of want to toss out to everybody, was this idea of thinking about human agency, both at an individual and collective level. And I guess kind of trying to see where or how people saw that in their work, even trying to look at these very broad structures. It was framed another way for all of you, that idea of wondering about the actual migrants and thinking about the tools that they come with them, their capacities in terms of education, health, those portable tools that folks bring with them. And so I guess I'm wondering, you know, even though we're thinking about these larger city and national and international structures, where folks are seeing this role for human agency. Peggy, there's one other question for you that was just very pragmatic. So I wanted to toss that out there, which was just that question of whether or not you had any recommendations for diasporic artists navigating these unfriendly waters. So
those are big questions and good questions. There is definitely, you know, the artists who are able to travel are the artists who, this is not just about a migration story, this is about anyone who's able to be an artist in a country that doesn't support your artists, which is, I can't speak for Canada, but I can say for the United States that I have 2 starving artist children, and I sure wish we lived in a country like Korea, because there's so much support for artists there, but it comes with costs, right? You have to produce in a certain way. You have to be part of this project. And so that's where the human agency comes in, that people are aware of these things. So curators and gallerists and museum professionals are aware of these things, and they make decisions about what they want to be party to and what they don't want to be party to. And the same thing with artists. There's a whole piece of this about what kind of art do you need to make that would travel? What kind of themes do you need to write about in a book that travels? What are universal themes, you know, that can be vernacularized so that they're interesting to a wide variety of audiences? And artists make a whole bunch of decisions about that. So some go away, and then they're a whole group, you know, talking about your types, Peter, I have types of artists. So it's like the ones who went away and then came back, and now they're making art about the 1 square acre that they live in, you know, and that has implications for circulation. And then there are ones that, what's his name, or Pamuk, who's said to write his books so they're more translatable now. I don't know if that's true, but I just raised that as an example of people who are very much making art with an eye towards you know, dissemination and circulation. So that's human agency.
That's so helpful, Peggy. Thank you so much. Jérémie, do you want to go ahead? Just keep in the order.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. I mean, the way I introduced the framework and the different compartments, it emphasizes a lot the role of the structures and the top-down government approach that institutes these compartments. But at the same time, I think that the human agency is very important in terms of decompartmentalizing, actually. So if you want to think about how this model can be broken up, you have to look at the way individual actors try to critique and to work out their way of this. So one of the aspects is what I've talked about in terms of the sophistication of the existing framework and national identity narrative. So this is already kind of something that is built in the system. It has been already kind of incorporated, but there are also other aspects, and especially one concerning the low-scale migrants who are also cultural entrepreneurs, and this is something I'm also interested in, is the way in which there has been the emergence of a cultural scene of the low-skilled migrant or construction workers who have been also involved in creating local cultural NGOs or even writing novels and books, poetry, these kinds of things, and also with the help of a national. So this is especially in Singapore and with the Singapore National Association, and this is a way for them to tell their own stories and to kind of also challenge the kinds of narratives and categorizations that are put upon them. So this is, I think, the idea of human agency is very important to kind of try to complexify a bit this compartmentalized model.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. Peter, I'm going to ask you the same question. I'm also going to let you know that I am going to have to probably cut you off because Sinthu will be very mad at me otherwise. But go ahead.
We don't want to make Sinthu very mad, so I'll be very very quick. No, so one thing, a human agency of so I think this is one of the things that we made tough decisions on. So we look at first generation migrants only as an ethical decision, because second generation hasn't migrated, so we don't call them a migrant or work with data in that regard. But if you look at it with a broad angle, I see good questions from Jens Schneider here also. I mean, the number of people who have a migration background of some generation is far bigger, and that makes it even more relevant in terms of agency. What we did find very much is that the agency of migrants in type 1, type 2, so the diversified and the post-industrial cities, is very powerful and recognized. We see it less in type 3 and type 4, so the left behind cities and the new migration cities. They tend to problematize migration more and also subject it to integrationist approaches. So I think this could also, the research can also be a contribution to showing to those cities how it can be organized differently, that you can also take all the positive benefits of from human agency, of migrant agency in these cities, or for making them a part of the city, and like in Ingrid Schiller's book, making them city makers, because that is very visible in type 1 and type 2, but that doesn't make it any less relevant for us to understand how they are then perceived and how they also feel within type 3 and type 4 cities, because I think that's the uncharted territory. We know type 1, type 2, we don't know type 3 and 4 very well, I think.
Yeah, that's super helpful, Peter. Thank you so much. We are fully out of time, unfortunately. I want to thank all the speakers so much for these really thought-provoking papers. I have a million more questions. There were more questions in the chat we couldn't get to, unfortunately, but the conversation continues. The next panel is actually tomorrow at noon, right back here in this same room. We'll get to travel again some more with some other great panels looking at cities, transit migration, and refugee population. So thanks again for everybody in the audience. Thanks to our speakers and to our organizers, and everyone have a great rest of your day.